Sergeant Jake Reynolds had seen enough broken equipment in the past 3 years to stock a museum of military disasters. But the battle suit limping through his repair depot's entrance defied every category of damage he'd learned to recognize. The Zephyrian armor moved like wounded poetry, its flowing lines disrupted by gaping holes that leaked the luminescent fluid that served as both coolant and neural interface medium. What really caught his attention, though, was the fact that someone was still wearing it. "Holy hell," Jake muttered, his hand automatically moving toward the plasma pistol at his hip before his brain caught up with what he was seeing. The figure inside the damaged suit was barely upright, supported more by the armor's emergency protocols than by any structural integrity that remained in the system. The Zephyrian warrior, and Jake could see now that it was definitely one of their people, despite the extensive armor coverage, raised one gauntleted hand in what might have been a gesture of surrender or simply an attempt to keep from falling over. "Please," she said, and Jake's universal translator helpfully informed him that the word carried overtones of desperation and formal politeness that didn't quite translate into standard. "I need assistance." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his combat training warring with what his mother would have called basic human decency. The Zephyrians were the enemy, had been the enemy for 3 years of brutal interstellar warfare that had cost humanity 6 colonies and approximately 2 million lives. On the other hand, this particular enemy looked like she was about 30 seconds away from collapse, and Jake had never been comfortable with the idea of shooting people who could barely stand. "Ma'am," he said carefully, keeping his hand near his weapon but not drawing it, "you do realize you're in a human military facility, right? Because if this is some kind of suicide mission, I should probably mention that the coffee here isn't worth dying for." The armored figure tilted her head slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of large, luminous eyes through the helmet's damaged visor. "Suicide mission. You know, infiltration, sabotage, glorious death for the cause." Jake gestured vaguely at the repair depot around them, which contained enough volatile equipment to level several city blocks if someone was feeling particularly destructive. "Standard enemy infiltration tactics." "I am not here for sabotage," she said, and Jake noticed that her voice carried a musical quality that the translator couldn't quite capture. "I am here because your facility was the closest source of compatible repair equipment, and my suit's life support systems will fail within the next 6 hours if I cannot effect repairs." Jake considered this. "So you're not here to kill me and blow up my workshop?" "No, you're here because you need me to fix your armor so you don't die." "Yes, Jake scratched his head, dislodging the maintenance cap he'd forgotten he was wearing. "That's either the most honest thing an enemy soldier has ever said to me, or the most elaborate psychological warfare gambit in military history." The Zephyrian warrior seemed to consider this. "I lack the energy for psychological warfare," she said finally. "Also, I believe I may be experiencing what you would call irony in this situation." Despite himself, Jake found his mouth quirking upward in what threatened to become a smile. "Yeah, war's funny like that, full of situations that nobody bothered to cover in basic training." He studied her more carefully, noting the way she favored her left side and the tremor in her hands that suggested either shock or systemic failure in her armor's neural interface. The battle suit itself was fascinating from a purely technical standpoint. Zephyrian engineering had always been more art than science, creating equipment that seemed to grow rather than be manufactured. "What's your name?" Jake asked, surprised to realize he genuinely wanted to know. "Kira," she replied, and something in the way she said it suggested it might not be her full name but was all she was willing to share with a human soldier. "Jake Reynolds," he said, then felt compelled to add Sergeant, Human Colonial Defense Forces, "but I guess the rank doesn't matter much in this context." "It does not," Kira agreed. "Will you help me, Jake Reynolds?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the alien armor and enemy designation to something that was fundamentally recognizable. A young soldier, far from home, scared and injured, and asking for help from someone who had every reason to refuse. "Yeah," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Yeah, I'll help you, but I'm going to need you to step out of that suit so I can get a proper look at the damage." Kira went very still. "The suit's environmental systems are the only thing keeping me alive in your atmosphere. Without it, you'll die," Jake finished. "Right, okay, that complicates things but not insurmountably. I've got an emergency life support chamber that should be compatible with Zephyrian physiology. We salvaged it from one of your downed ships 6 months ago. You have Zephyrian life support equipment." "Ma'am, I've got parts and pieces from half the ships in this sector. War's been good for business, terrible for everything else." Jake moved toward a section of his workshop that was draped in protective sheeting. "The question is whether you trust me enough to use it." Kira was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could practically hear the risk assessment calculations running through her head. Finally, she said, "I have little choice in the matter." "That's the spirit," Jake said, pulling away the sheeting to reveal a cylindrical chamber that pulsed with soft, blue-white light. "Nothing says mutual trust like desperation and the absence of alternatives." As Kira began the delicate process of disconnecting from her battle suit's internal systems, Jake found himself wondering how exactly his life had reached the point where he was providing life support to enemy soldiers. 3 years ago, he'd been a mechanical engineering student at New Melbourne University, more concerned with differential equations than differential species relations. Then the war had come to his home system, and suddenly theoretical knowledge about alien technology had become a matter of survival for everyone he cared about. "Jake Reynolds," Kira said softly, her voice now unfiltered by the suit's communication system and somehow more human for the lack of technological mediation. "Why are you helping me?" Jake paused in his preparation of the life support chamber, considering the question. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe because you asked instead of trying to kill me. Maybe because I've spent 3 years fixing things that were broken by violence, and I'm tired of seeing how much everything costs to destroy. And maybe because someone has to start somewhere," Jake said, meeting her luminous gaze through the damaged visor. "And this seems like as good a place as any." The Zephyrian life support chamber hummed with an oddly soothing frequency that Jake's technical manuals had failed to mention, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a meditation room than a piece of military equipment. Through the transparent aluminum viewing port, he could see Kira breathing steadily in the blue-tinted atmosphere that her species required, her pointed ears and delicate features finally visible without the distortion of her helmet's damaged visor. She was, Jake realized with some surprise, remarkably human-looking despite the obvious differences. Her skin had a subtle luminescence that seemed to shift with her emotional state, and her hair fell in waves that caught the chamber's light like spun silver. But her facial structure and proportions were close enough to human normal that his brain didn't struggle to process her as a person rather than an alien entity. "The suit's neural interface system is more complex than I anticipated," Jake said, running his diagnostic scanner over the armor's primary control node. "It's not just responding to conscious commands, it's integrating with your autonomic nervous system, monitoring everything from heart rate to stress hormones." "Zephyrian technology is designed for total integration," Kira replied, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's communication system. "The suit becomes an extension of the warrior's body and mind. Without proper synchronization, it is merely decorative." Jake paused in his analysis, looking up at her through the viewing port. "That explains why you couldn't just abandon it when it started failing. It wasn't just your protection, it was part of you." "In a manner of speaking, yes." Kira's luminescent skin darkened slightly, what Jake was beginning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of a blush. "The integration process is intimate, personal. It is not something we typically discuss with outsiders. Sorry, Jake said, returning his attention to the suit's damaged systems. I didn't mean to pry into personal stuff. I just need to understand how it works if I'm going to fix it properly. You are not prying, Kira said quietly. You are the first person in 6 days who has treated me as something other than a threat to be eliminated or a problem to be solved. Your curiosity is refreshing. Jake felt something twist in his chest at the loneliness in her voice. 6 days. You've been on your own for 6 days. My unit was separated during your people's orbital bombardment of the Kepler station complex. I was conducting reconnaissance when the attack began, and by the time I could return to our position, there was nothing left but debris and... Kira's voice trailed off, and Jake noticed the way her luminescence fluctuated with what was clearly emotional distress. I'm sorry, Jake said and meant it. War's hell for everyone involved. I've lost people too. Yes, Kira said simply. I have studied human psychological profiles. Your species experiences grief in ways that are similar to ours, though you express it differently. Jake looked up from the suit's damaged power coupling, struck by something in her tone. You've studied humans. It was part of my training. Know your enemy, understand their weaknesses, predict their behavior patterns. Kira's expression was visible through the viewing port, and Jake caught what might have been regret in her large eyes. Though the more I learn about your people, the more I wonder if enemy is the correct classification. What would be the correct classification? Kira was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I think perhaps you are simply different. Not better or worse than my people, just different enough that fear and misunderstanding have been allowed to grow into hatred. Jake felt his hands slow on the repair work as he processed this. That's a pretty enlightened perspective for someone whose species has been trying to exterminate mine for the past 3 years. And your species has been trying to exterminate mine, Kira pointed out, though without heat. But you are not trying to exterminate me. You are trying to repair my life support system and asking about my experiences with curiosity rather than interrogation. This suggests that perhaps the propaganda both our species have been fed is incomplete. Jake couldn't argue with that logic. The official briefings had described Zephyrians as emotionless killing machines, bred for war and incapable of individual thought or feeling. The young woman in the life support chamber was clearly none of those things. Can I ask you something personal? Jake said, working his way through a particularly complex section of the suit's neural interface matrix. You may ask. I will decide whether to answer. Why are you really here? I mean, there had to be other options for getting your suit repaired. Zephyrian equipment, friendly forces, something that didn't involve walking into an enemy facility and hoping for the best. Kira's luminescence shifted to deeper hues, and she was quiet for so long that Jake began to wonder if he'd crossed some kind of cultural boundary. Finally, she spoke. There are no other Zephyrian forces within 300 kilometers. The nearest equipment cache was destroyed in yesterday's fighting, and she paused, seeming to struggle with something. And I have been monitoring human communications for 6 days. I have heard your repair requests, your conversations with other technicians, your interactions with wounded soldiers. You've been listening to our comm traffic. Not for intelligence purposes, Kira said quickly. My suit's communication array was damaged, but still capable of passive monitoring. I was trying to determine safe routes to avoid human patrols when I began hearing your voice. Jake felt his cheeks warm. What exactly did you hear? You talking a young soldier through panic attack when his armor's medical systems malfunctioned. You staying up all night to repair a transport that was needed for civilian evacuation. You arguing with your commanding officers about the ethics of salvaging equipment from enemy casualties. Kira's expression through the viewing port was soft and somehow sad. You sounded like someone who remembered that there were people inside the equipment you repair. It's just part of the job, Jake said, uncomfortable with the praise. No, Kira said firmly. It is not. I have monitored other human technical personnel. Most are efficient, professional, competent. You are all of those things, but you are also kind. When I realized my suit would fail completely within hours, you were the only human I felt I could trust with my life. Jake stared at her for a moment, struck by the weight of that trust and the responsibility it represented. Kira, I need to ask, what happens when I finish these repairs? What happens when your suit is functional again? I do not know, she admitted. My original mission parameters are no longer relevant. My unit is gone, my objectives are compromised, and my understanding of this conflict has been altered by recent experiences. Altered how? Kira's smile was visible through the viewing port, small and uncertain but genuine. 3 days ago, I believed humans were incapable of mercy or compassion. Today, I am alive because a human soldier chose to help rather than harm. It is difficult to maintain one's prejudices in the face of such contradictory evidence. Jake turned back to the battle suit, his hands working automatically through familiar repair procedures, while his mind processed everything Kira had told him. The neural interface matrix was more sophisticated than anything he'd encountered, but the basic principles were universal. Damaged components needed replacement, severed connections required re-establishment, and broken systems demanded careful reconstruction. Jake, Kira said softly, may I ask why you chose engineering instead of combat specialization? Same reason you chose reconnaissance over frontline assault. I'd guess, Jake replied, calibrating a replacement power coupling with the kind of precision that came from 3 years of practice. Some of us are better at building things than we are at breaking them. And some of us, Kira said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope, are better at understanding than we are at destroying. Jake was deep in the most delicate phase of the neural interface reconstruction when he noticed the tears. At first, he thought it might be condensation from the life support chamber's atmospheric recycling system, but when he looked up from the intricate web of biomechanical connections he was rebuilding, he saw Kira's luminescent skin glistening with moisture that had nothing to do with environmental controls. She was crying, silently, without the sobbing or facial contortions that marked human emotional distress, but unmistakably crying. The tears traced silver paths down her cheeks, and her usually steady luminescence flickered like a candle in a gentle breeze. Kira, Jake set down his neural interface calibrator and moved closer to the life support chamber. Are you in pain? Is the atmospheric mixture wrong? Do I need to? No, she said quickly, wiping at her face with hands that trembled slightly. The life support is functioning perfectly. I am not experiencing physical discomfort. Then what's wrong? Jake found himself genuinely concerned in a way that had nothing to do with professional responsibility, and everything to do with the fact that he'd somehow started thinking of this enemy soldier as a person he cared about. Kira was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands as if they held answers to questions she hadn't known she was asking. When she finally looked up, her large eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that looked like shame. The suit you are repairing, she said slowly, it belonged to my sister. Jake felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Belonged. I was not supposed to be a soldier, Kira continued, the words spilling out now like water through a broken dam. I was a xenobiology student studying cross-species adaptation patterns. When the war reached our system, when the evacuation began, I volunteered for the reconnaissance corps because someone had to, and I had some small experience with alien environments. Jake looked at the battle suit he'd been repairing with such care, seeing it now not just as sophisticated equipment, but as a memorial, a connection to loss that was almost too profound to comprehend. But you couldn't use it properly, he said gently. The neural integration was calibrated for your sister's patterns, not yours. Every time I interface with the system, I can feel her ghost in the connections. Her muscle memory, her combat reflexes, her absolute certainty about what needed to be done. Kira's luminescence had shifted to deep, mournful blues that Jake found heartbreakingly beautiful. I have spent 6 months trying to be worthy of her armor, trying to fill the space she left behind, and I am failing at every turn. Kira, Jake said, pressing his hand against the viewing port in what he hoped was a comforting gesture. You're not failing. You're surviving. There's a difference. I am wearing the armor of a warrior while possessing the heart of a scholar, she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Do you know what that feels like? To carry the expectations of the dead, while knowing you are not equal to their memory. Jake thought about his own ghosts, the friends he'd lost in the early days of the war, the civilians he hadn't been able to save, the weight of decisions made in moments when there was no time to consider consequences. Yeah, he said quietly, I know exactly what that feels like. Then you understand why I cannot simply return to my people with a repaired suit and pretend to be the warrior they need me to be. Jake studied her face through the transparent aluminum, noting the way her features combined strength and vulnerability in a way that reminded him powerfully of his own reflection after particularly difficult days. What if I told you that you don't have to be a warrior? I do not understand. The repairs I'm making to your sister's armor, they're not just fixing what was broken. I'm adapting the neural interface matrix to work with your patterns instead of hers. Jake gestured toward the suit's control systems, where human diagnostic equipment interfaced with Zephyrian biotechnology in ways that would have been impossible just a few hours earlier. When I'm finished, this won't be Zara's armor anymore. It'll be yours. Kira's eyes widened. You can do that. I'm doing it right now. The integration process will be different, less focused on combat reflexes, more attuned to observational and analytical functions. Essentially, I'm creating a scholar's armor that happens to provide warrior-level protection. But why? Kira asked. Why would you spend so much time and effort customizing enemy equipment for my specific needs? Jake considered the question, his hands continuing their work on the neural interface, while his mind processed feelings he wasn't entirely comfortable examining too closely. Because you're not my enemy, he said finally. You're a person who got handed a situation she never trained for and is doing her best to survive it with honor. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be respected. Your people would call this treason, Kira pointed out, though her voice carried more wonder than condemnation. Probably, Jake agreed. But my people aren't here right now. It's just me. And my judgment is that helping someone become the best version of themselves isn't treason. It's just basic decency. Kira was crying again, but now her tears seemed to carry relief rather than sorrow. Jake Reynolds, she said softly, you are either the most foolish human I have ever encountered or the wisest. Can it be both? Despite everything, Kira laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal and starlight. Yes, I believe it can be both. As Jake returned to his work on the neural interface, he found himself thinking about identity and adaptation, about the difference between becoming someone new and betraying who you used to be. The modifications he was making to Kira's armor were revolutionary in more ways than one. They represented a fusion of human and Zephyrian technology that neither species had achieved before. Kira, he said as the first phase of the neural recalibration came online, when this is finished, you're going to have capabilities that no other Zephyrian has ever possessed. The question is, what are you going to do with them? Kira's luminescence had shifted to warm golds and soft greens, colors that Jake was beginning to associate with hope and determination. I think, she said carefully, I am going to try to be worthy of the trust you have placed in me. And perhaps, if I am very fortunate, I will find a way to help others understand that the space between our species is not as vast as we have been taught to believe. Jake smiled, feeling something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized was tense. I think your sister would be proud of that choice. And I think, Kira said, her tears now carrying joy instead of sorrow, that you are helping me become someone she would have been proud to call family. Dawn crept across the Kepler 442b landscape like a shy artist unveiling a masterpiece, painting the sky in shades of amber, and rose that Jake had learned to appreciate during his years on this contested world. Inside his repair depot, the final phase of Kira's armor integration was reaching completion, and the results exceeded even his optimistic projections. The neural synchronization is at 97%, Jake announced, watching the readouts cascade across his diagnostic display. That's better than most human soldiers achieve with their own equipment on the first attempt. Kira emerged from the life support chamber, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost dance-like, her newly calibrated armor responding to her thoughts and intentions with seamless precision. The suit had transformed during their night of work together, still recognizably Zephyrian in its flowing, organic lines, but now incorporating human technological elements that created something entirely new. It feels. Kira paused, her luminescent skin shifting through a spectrum of colors that Jake had learned to interpret as wonder mixed with gratitude. It feels like coming home to a place I have never been. The biomechanical integration is designed to learn and adapt, Jake explained, trying to keep the pride out of his voice as he watched her test the suit's various systems. The longer you wear it, the more perfectly it will attune to your specific patterns. In a few weeks, it'll be more responsive than any armor has ever been for any warrior of either species. You have given me more than repaired equipment, Kira said, turning to face him with those large, luminous eyes that had haunted his thoughts through the long night of technical work. You have given me the possibility of becoming who I was meant to be rather than who I was expected to be. Jake felt heat creep up his neck at the intensity of her gratitude. I just fixed what was broken and made a few improvements. That's what engineers do. No, Kira said firmly, stepping closer with movements that were now perfectly controlled and utterly silent. Engineers repair mechanical systems. You have repaired something far more fundamental. Before Jake could ask what she meant, his communication console chirped with an incoming priority message. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern features of Colonel Martinez, his commanding officer and a woman who had never met a problem she couldn't solve with applied military force. Reynolds, the colonel's image said, we've got multiple Zephyrian contacts moving through your sector. Recommend you secure all sensitive equipment and prepare for possible extraction. Jake glanced at Kira, noting the way her armor's defensive systems had automatically activated at the mention of approaching forces. Colonel, the contacts you're detecting, are they hostile? All Zephyrian contacts are considered hostile until proven otherwise, Sergeant. That's basic protocol. Yes, ma'am, but I'm asking specifically about their behavior patterns. Are they advancing aggressively or moving with evacuation vectors? There was a pause while Colonel Martinez consulted her tactical displays. Now that you mention it, they appear to be following non-combatant movement patterns. Why do you ask? Jake felt Kira's hand touch his shoulder, her armor's tactile interface allowing her to communicate through pressure and warmth in a way that bypassed language entirely. In that touch, he felt her question, her fear, and her trust all mingled together. Colonel, I think they might be survivors looking for someone. Survivors looking for whom, Sergeant? Jake met Kira's gaze, seeing his own decision reflected in her luminous eyes. Permission to establish communication with the incoming contacts, ma'am. I believe I may have information relevant to their search. Absolutely not, Reynolds. You're a repair technician, not a diplomatic attaché. With respect, Colonel, sometimes the best diplomacy happens between people who just want to fix what's broken. Before Colonel Martinez could respond, Kira stepped into the communication field, her newly integrated armor automatically adjusting its translation protocols to interface with human systems. Colonel Martinez, she said, her voice carrying the musical qualities of her native language while remaining perfectly comprehensible. I am Scout Analyst Kira of the Zephyrian Reconnaissance Corps. The contacts approaching your position are members of my original unit, searching for survivors from the Kepler station evacuation. The silence on the communication link stretched long enough for Jake to wonder if the system had malfunctioned. Finally, Colonel Martinez spoke. Sergeant Reynolds, please explain to me why there is a Zephyrian soldier in your repair facility who appears to be cooperating with human military communications. It's a long story, Colonel, Jake said. But the short version is that sometimes people need help, and sometimes helping them turns out to be the right thing to do regardless of what species they happen to be. And the longer version. Jake looked at Kira, seeing in her expression the same mixture of hope and determination that had carried them through the night. The longer version is that I think we've discovered something that could change how this war ends. Over the next hour, Jake found himself facilitating the most unusual military negotiation in human history. Kira's surviving unit members, 3 other scouts who had been searching for her since the orbital bombardment, approached the repair facility under a hastily arranged ceasefire. What followed was a careful dance of trust building that involved shared technical knowledge, mutual aid agreements, and the kind of practical cooperation that military theorists claimed was impossible between warring species. Your modifications to our scouts' equipment are remarkable, observed Unit Commander Thex, examining Kira's upgraded armor with professional interest. The integration of human adaptive systems with Zephyrian biomechanical interfaces creates capabilities that neither species has achieved independently. Jake found himself explaining his modifications to an audience of enemy soldiers who hung on his every word with the intensity of students attending the most important lecture of their lives. The key was realizing that your biomechanical systems and our adaptive algorithms aren't competing technologies, they're complementary ones. When you merge them properly, you get something that's more than the sum of its parts. This suggests possibilities for broader technological cooperation, Commander Thex noted, his own armor's translation systems rendering his musical language into precise, technical standard. Perhaps even collaborative development of defensive systems that could benefit both our species. That's exactly what it suggests, Jake agreed, then paused as he realized the implications of what they were discussing. Commander, can I ask you something? You may ask, what would happen if your people and mine spent more time sharing knowledge instead of trying to destroy each other? What could we accomplish together that neither of us could manage alone? Commander Thex was quiet for a long moment, his armor's luminescence shifting through contemplative hues. That, Sergeant Reynolds, is a question that has haunted many of us since this conflict began. We have spent so much effort learning to fight each other that we have forgotten to ask whether we should be fighting at all. Kira stepped forward, her newly integrated armor moving with perfect silence and grace. Jake has given me more than repaired equipment, she said, addressing both her commander and the human soldiers who had gathered to witness this unprecedented meeting. He has given me proof that understanding is possible, that cooperation can create solutions that neither aggression nor isolation can achieve. And what do you propose we do with this proof? Commander Thex asked. We take it home, Kira replied. Both of us. We show our leaders that the space between our species is not an unbridgeable void but a frontier waiting to be explored through collaboration rather than conquest. Jake felt Colonel Martinez's skeptical gaze through the communication link, but when she spoke, her voice carried more curiosity than condemnation. Sergeant, are you seriously suggesting that a single repair job has solved an interstellar war? No, ma'am, Jake said. I'm suggesting that it's proved interstellar war isn't the only option. What we've accomplished here, human and Zephyrian technology working together to create something better than either could produce alone, that's a proof of concept for cooperation on a much larger scale. The technical specifications alone could revolutionize defensive capabilities for both our species, Commander Thex added. But more importantly, the process of creating them has demonstrated that our peoples can work together productively when we focus on shared problems rather than historical grievances. Colonel Martinez was quiet for several minutes, presumably consulting with her superiors through encrypted channels. When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral. Sergeant Reynolds, you and your collaborative partner are to report to Sector Command for debriefing. Commander Thex, your unit is granted safe passage under ceasefire protocols, pending further negotiations. As the formal military procedures took over, Jake found himself standing beside Kira in the growing morning light, both of them exhausted but oddly exhilarated by what they had accomplished. What happens now? Kira asked, her voice soft with uncertainty. Now we find out whether our leaders are as interested in building bridges as we are, Jake replied. But regardless of what they decide, we've proved something important.